Okay, this outcome is about chemical changes and looking at everyday chemical changes, and I'm going to, in a series of videos, show you some simple examples of chemical reactions that you can do within your primary school that hopefully will give you some ideas to take away and do. I want to just start by explaining what we mean by a chemical change or a chemical reaction, and explain it in a way that hopefully you can explain it to the primary pupils that they'll understand and hopefully remember. Probably the easiest way to explain a chemical change is to think about things around the home, and one of the most obvious chemical changes that we come across is when we cook food or we bake a cake. All of these are examples of chemical changes. In fact, a really simple example of that is when we make toast. So I've got a bit of brown bread here, and in the morning, if we make our breakfast, very often we turn this into toast. This is a really good way of perhaps introducing chemical reactions to primary pupils, because they all know what bread is, they all know what toast is, and when we turn bread into toast, we obviously burn the surface of it. It's easy to turn bread into toast, and that's a chemical reaction. And the reason it's a chemical reaction is because it's irreversible. Nobody can turn a bit of toast back into a fresh bit of bread. And that's the key point that it's important to get across to the pupils, that chemical reactions are irreversible. So you can't go back the way. Easy to go from bread to toast, but impossible to go from toast back to bread. So a simple introduction like that, and most pupils will understand that and get it. Another example you might want to use to explain chemical reactions is simply with an egg, and to talk about baking. Some of the primary pupils might bake in their spare time, and they'll all know that you can bake a cake using things like flour, eggs, milk, but nobody can unbake a cake. And again, baking a cake is an example of a chemical reaction. So we can take the cake mixture, turn it into a cake. There's a chemical change, but we can't go back the way. And simply, I've got my egg here, cracking it open. We've got the egg here, and you might want to do this within the classroom to try and emphasise that we've got this raw egg here, and then you could, perhaps by putting some boiling water in it from a kettle, poach it to show the changes that happen. And again, the pupils hopefully will understand that you can't go from the cooked egg back to the raw egg. So it must be a chemical reaction. It's only going one way. So another example of an everyday chemical reaction that you can perhaps introduce the topic. Now, some things, of course, are reversible and can go back the way, but we would never describe these as chemical reactions, or at least not at a primary level. These are examples of what we might call physical changes. And probably the simplest example of a physical change is to dissolve a substance, to take a soluble substance, for instance salt here, which you can easily get hold of, and to dissolve it. So I have a little plastic cup here, and if I just put some salt into the cup, like so, and just add some water to it, then again, hopefully the pupils get the idea that the salt will dissolve into the water simply by swirling it or stirring it around. But it's not a chemical reaction. And the reason it's not a chemical reaction is, of course, because you can go back the way. You can get the salt back out of it. And the way you would do that, of course, is to let the water evaporate. So it might be worth while you're explaining chemical reactions, to get the pupils to set this up, perhaps in a plastic cup like this, bring in some salt and get them to dissolve up a little bit, and then just to leave the cup someplace warm. Over a matter of days, the water will evaporate and they'll be left with the salt back again. So it's reversible. You've dissolved the salt, but then you've got the salt back out by letting the water evaporate again. Okay, so it can go back and forward, and therefore it's not a chemical reaction, it's a physical change. And again, a really simple example that the pupils will hopefully understand. And one final simple little experiment to introduce this topic is to talk about melting and freezing of substances. And again, probably at a primary level, the simplest substance you can talk about and that the pupils will understand is water and ice. So I've got some ice cubes here, and I've got this warm metal dish here. However, you don't need to use anything like this. You could just put it into a cup, or even into a plastic cup like I showed you earlier. And if I take an ice cube out from here, okay, take an ice cube out, and if I just put the ice cube onto here, well, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to melt. So if I just leave it there for a matter of seconds, you can already see it starting to melt. Now, hopefully, if you do this as a little demonstration, you can get the pupils to talk about the ice melting, so it's turning into a liquid, but you can also ask how we could get the liquid water to turn back into ice again. And I would imagine most pupils would understand that simply by putting this back into the freezer again, making it cold again, it will turn back into ice again. So again, a really simple example of a physical change. We can melt it, but then we can freeze it. So we can go back and forward simply by heating it up or cooling it down. So there are 4 simple little introductory experiments or demonstrations you can do with the class, which will introduce the pupils to the idea of chemical changes, chemical reactions and physical changes.